In 1943, Henry J. Kaiser made a promise that sounded like madness. He promised to build a fully functional aircraft carrier in just 90 days. The experts laughed. A real carrier took 2 years, sometimes more. Kaiser did it in 72. Then he did it again and again. Soon his shipyards were launching a new carrier nearly every single week. You're looking at the birth of the escort carrier, the CVE. But look closer. This is not a warship. Not really. It is built on the simple, flat-bottomed hull of a cargo ship. Its armor is so thin, sailors joked you could cut through it with a kitchen knife. Its top speed was a sluggish 19 knots, while a Japanese Zero could dive at over 300. A true fleet carrier could leave it in its wake without even trying. This was not a predator. It was prey. American sailors had names for their new home. CVE. Combustible, vulnerable, expendable. They called them Jeep carriers, or, more grimly, Kaiser's coffins. They knew exactly what they were sailing on, a floating target. And here's the part that history often forgets. The Japanese pilots saw them too. Through their cockpit glass, these ships looked like toys. Pathetic. They reported back to their commanders about America's cardboard carriers. They became a running joke in the Imperial Navy. An easy kill, a waste of a good torpedo. Imagine you are an 18-year-old mechanic on the deck of one. The steel beneath your feet groans with every wave. You know your ship cannot outrun a destroyer. You know it cannot survive a direct hit from a battleship. And you know your mission is to sail directly towards the most feared naval force on the planet. Over 120 of these coffins were sent to the Pacific. The Japanese saw a fleet of disposable targets, a sign of American desperation. They prepared to sink them by the dozen. But they missed one critical detail, a detail hidden in plain sight that would turn their laughter into shock. What did they fail to see? December 7th, 1941. America is reeling. Its Pacific Fleet is a graveyard of burning steel at the bottom of Pearl Harbor. The nation needs warships, it needs aircraft carriers, and it needs them yesterday. But a fleet carrier, a true titan of the sea, takes years to build. Years America does not have. The call goes out for a miracle. The man who answers is not a shipbuilder. He builds dams. His name is Henry J. Kaiser, and he makes a promise to President Roosevelt that sounds like madness. He says he can build small aircraft carriers, dozens of them, and he can build them faster than anyone thought possible. He wasn't talking about years. He was talking about months, even weeks. Think about that. A floating airfield from raw steel to ocean-ready in less time than it takes for the seasons to change. Washington, D.C. was skeptical. The old guard of the Navy was horrified, but they were also desperate. So they gave Kaiser the green light, and in doing so, they accidentally approved a weapon their enemy would never see coming. Here's where the story gets really interesting. Kaiser applied a radical idea to ship. He took the assembly line that built your family car and put it on the water. Before Kaiser, ships were built piece by piece in a dry dock, a single enormous bespoke project, rivet by rivet. Kaiser threw out the rule book. His shipyards, like the one in Richmond, California, didn't build ships. They assembled them. Huge sections of the hull were prefabricated in separate workshops across the country. They were built indoors, day and night, rain or shine. Then these massive steel components, weighing up to 200 tons each, were brought to the water's edge. Cranes, like giant mechanical birds, would lift them into place. Welders, thousands of them, many of them women, would seal the seams. Welding was faster and lighter than riveting. It was the key. The result? A blur of speed. The first of his carriers, the USS Casablanca, was built in 241 days. 2. Kaiser pushed his workers. The next one took 101 days. Soon they were launching a new carrier every single week. One ship, the USS Robert E. Peary, went from keel laying to launch in an impossible time. 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. Read that again. An entire warship built in the time it takes to have a long weekend. But to achieve this speed, you have to make sacrifices. Big ones. Look closely at the plans for these escort carriers, or CVEs. You will not find thick armor belts. And the hull plating was just 3/8 of an inch thick. A single well-aimed shell from a Japanese cruiser could tear right through it. You will not find sophisticated torpedo protection. There were no anti-torpedo bulges. A single torpedo hit would likely prove fatal. They ran on unrefined diesel fuel, which gave off explosive vapors. Their own sailors had nicknames for them, not jeep carriers. They called them Kaiser coffins. They called them combustible, vulnerable, expendable. That was the CVE acronym for the men who served on them. These were not ships designed to survive a fight. They were floating fuel tanks carrying 28 aircraft, 650,000 gallons of aviation gasoline, and 1,000 human beings. They were an industrial gamble. America was betting on quantity over quality. They were a disposable fleet. And the Japanese? When their intelligence officers saw these reports, they saw the pictures, and they laughed. To a naval culture that revered the battleship, that believed in the single, decisive blow from a perfectly engineered war machine, the CVE was an insult. They called them cigar boxes. They called them cardboard carriers. They were a joke. Imperial Navy pilots were told that hitting one was a waste of a good torpedo. The Japanese admirals saw 100 flimsy targets. They saw a sign of desperation, a sign of weakness. They saw an enemy forced to build its navy out of tin cans. They were so confident in their judgment, so sure of their superiority. But they missed something hidden in plain sight. They saw the thin armor, but they didn't see the 2,800 aircraft those carriers could put in the sky. They saw a disposable ship, but they didn't see the fierce determination of the men sailing it. They prepared for a war of steel against steel. They had no idea they were about to face a war of attrition against a factory that floated. The stage was set. On one side, the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy. On the other, a fleet of ships their own sailors called coffins. And so the fatal question hung in the Pacific air, completely ignored by the Japanese command. What happens when the cardboard fights back? October 25th, 1944. Dawn breaks over the Philippine Sea. And for the men of a tiny American task force codenamed Taffy 3, the world is about to end. On their radar screens, a nightmare takes shape. It is the most powerful surface fleet Japan has left, and it is heading straight for them. You are on the deck of one of 6 escort carriers, a ship the Japanese call a floating coffin. Your armor is so thin a destroyer's shell could pass right through you. Your top speed is a sluggish 18 knots. You are protecting hundreds of troop knots. You are protecting hundreds of troop transports. You are a sheepdog, and you've just run into a pack of wolves. The pack is Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force. 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 11 destroyers. Leading them is the Yamato, the largest, most powerful battleship ever constructed. Its main guns fire shells weighing over 3,000 pounds, shells the size of a small car. and they have a range of 26 miles. Your largest gun has a range of 9. The first Japanese salvos scream overhead. Geysers of water erupt around the ships, colored by dye to help the gunners aim. Green, pink, orange. It looks like a perverse celebration. And you have to be asking the question, where is the American fleet? Where is Admiral Halsey's mighty Third Fleet with its fast battleships and carriers? The answer is a cold one. Halsey was gone. He had taken his entire fleet, all 64 ships, on a chase hundreds of miles to the north, lured away by a Japanese decoy force of carriers with almost no planes. He left the gate wide open. Taffy 3 was completely, utterly alone. The official record calls it a communications failure, but the men about to die would have called it something else. Outnumbered and outgunned, the American commander, Admiral Clifton Sprague, gives the only logical order: run. He orders his carriers to flee into a nearby rain squall for cover, while his screen of destroyers make smoke. But one man decides running is not an option. On the bridge of the destroyer USS Johnston, Commander Ernest Evans makes a decision that borders on insanity. He is not going to run. He is going to attack. Think about that. A 2,100-ton destroyer is turning to charge a 72,000-ton battleship. It's a rowboat attacking a whale. Evans tells his crew, "This will be a fighting ship. I will never retreat from an enemy force." He wasn't lying. The Johnston steams directly into the Japanese formation. Its 5-inch guns are firing, chipping paint off the enemy cruisers. When the crew fires all 10 of its torpedoes, one strikes the heavy cruiser Kumano, blowing its bow off. The whale was bleeding, and then the other sheepdogs joined the fight. The destroyers Hole and Hirman charged in. Then the even smaller destroyer escorts. The Samuel B. Roberts, the Raymond, the Dennis. These were the tin cans. They laid smoke. They dodged salvos. They fired every shell and torpedo they had. They were fighting with the fury of the doomed. And what about the cardboard carriers? They launched every plane they had. Avengers and Wildcats. Armed with whatever was available, general-purpose bombs. Depth charges meant for submarines. Some pilots took off with nothing but their machine guns. They made strafing runs on the bridges of Japanese battleships. They performed dummy bombing runs, making the giant ships turn and swerve. The Japanese gunners, confused by the smoke and the sheer ferocity of the attack, reported they were fighting a fleet of heavy cruisers and battleships. They couldn't believe destroyers would be this aggressive. They couldn't believe these tiny carriers were so hard to kill. For 2.5 hours, this impossible battle raged. And here is the part that still baffles historians. Admiral Kurita, with total victory in his grasp, hesitated. He had sunk the Johnston, the Hole, the Samuel B. Roberts, the carrier Gambier Bay. But the relentless suicidal attacks had shattered his formations and his confidence. Believing he was facing a much larger force, he made an unbelievable choice. He turned around. Kurita retreated. Taffy 3, the expendable unit, had held the line, and they saved the entire American invasion of the Philippines. It was one of the most heroic moments in the history of naval warfare. The survivors, clinging to wreckage in the vast empty ocean, thought the worst was over. They had faced the monster and won. But the story doesn't end there, because as Kurita's battleships vanished over the horizon, a new shadow was falling from the sky. The men who had just survived steel shells were about to meet an enemy born of pure desperation. The divine wind was coming. For a Japanese sailor on the deck of the super battleship Yamato, it began as a joke. They called the American ships Katanbo Maru, dragonfly ships, flimsy carriers made of wood and paper. But on the morning of October 25, 1944, off the coast of Samar Island, the laughter died in their throats. You are on that steel deck. You feel the deep rumble of the world's largest naval guns. You see dots on the horizon, tiny specks. They grow larger. They are not dragonflies. They are hornets. Hundreds of them. The sky doesn't just darken. It screams. First comes the sound, a high-pitched whine that tears at your nerves. It's the sound of an SBD Dauntless dive bomber in a terminal dive. Then you see it, a plane pointing its nose straight at your ship, growing impossibly large. There is nowhere to run. The world becomes a storm of noise and violence. The deck beneath your feet shudders from the impact of 500-pound bombs. Geysers of water, hundreds of feet high, erupt beside the hull as torpedoes miss their mark. The air smells of salt, cordite, and burning paint. This is what it felt like to be hunted by a CVE. But who was inside those planes? They weren't faceless demons. They were boys. Boys like 21-year-old Lieutenant J.G. Tex O'Neill flying a Grumman Avenger. Imagine yourself in his seat. The cockpit is cramped, smelling of oil and sweat. Your knuckles are white on the stick as you take off from the USS Gambier Bay. The carrier's deck pitches violently in the waves. It's not an airport runway. It's a 500-foot strip of moving steel. And for a moment, your plane drops towards the churning sea before the engine catches and you climb. Your target appears. The Japanese Center Force, a collection of the most powerful warships ever built. Your squadron is ordered to attack. You have 1 torpedo. Your wingman has 2 bombs. That's it. This is the moment nobody talks about. The pilots of Task Force Taffy 3 ran out of ammunition. Fast. Did they fly home? No. They kept attacking. They made dry runs, diving on battleships with empty guns, hoping to draw fire, to distract, to make the Japanese commanders think they were still a threat. They were a bluff, a desperate, suicidal bluff. Commander Ernest Evans of the destroyer USS Johnston charged his tiny ship directly at the enemy fleet. He knew it was a one-way trip. His last transmission was simple. "I intend to go in harm's way." He did. His ship was torn apart by 14-inch shells. But he bought time. Time for the boys in the hornets' nests to keep stinging. The Japanese commanders, confused by the sheer ferocity of the attack, believed they were facing a full fleet of large carriers. They hesitated. And then they turned back. A fleet of Titans chased away by cardboard carriers and pilots with nothing left but courage. The pilot, Tex O'Neill, makes it back to his carrier. His plane is riddled with shrapnel. He can barely land, but he's alive. He climbs out of the cockpit, his legs shaking, and walks into the ready room. He sees the empty chairs, the names of friends on the chalkboard, now marked missing. He had survived, but the cost of that survival was written on the faces of the men around him, and in the silence that filled the spaces where laughter used to be. The war ends. Victory parades fill the streets of America. You see the ticker tape fall in Times Square, a snowstorm of celebration, and the little ships that could. The escort carriers, they come home as heroes. Their job is done. But here's the part of the story they don't put in the parades. The United States commissioned over 120 of these CVEs, 120 floating airfields that helped turn the tide in the Atlantic and the Pacific. By 1947, just 2 years after the victory, almost every single one of them was gone. Gone, not to a museum, not to a memorial fleet. They were sold for pennies on the dollar to the scrap yard. The same hands that had frantically welded them together now held the cutting torches to tear them apart. Think about what that means. You are a sailor who served on the USS St. Lo. You felt the deck shudder as the first kamikaze in history struck your ship. You survived. Your home did not. And now the sister ships that fought alongside you are being melted down to make girders fors, or maybe fenders for new cars. The logic was cold, brutal, and in a way, completely correct. They were never meant to last. They were tools, disposable instruments for a desperate job. Their very weakness, their thin, unarmored skin, was the secret to their greatest strength. It meant they could be built in weeks, not years. An entire armada of the expendable. The Japanese strategists who laughed at these ships were right about the steel. It was thin. They were right about the design. It was simple, but they missed the fundamental truth. You don't always need an indestructible fortress to win a war. Sometimes, you just need enough ships, enough planes, enough courage to sail a cardboard carrier into the teeth of a battle fleet. Today, only fragments remain. A ship's bell in a small-town museum, a plaque on a waterfront, fading photographs in a family album. The ships themselves are ghosts, echoes on the water. They were designed for a single, violent purpose, and they fulfilled it perfectly. Then, they vanished. It forces you to ask a difficult question. When something serves its purpose, does it lose its value? We build things to solve our problems, to win our wars, to save us from the brink. And when the crisis passes, what do we owe the very things that saved us?